Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today, and welcome to Niagara Falls. This, I hope, will be the scene of my greatest triumph against the power of water, a power I have sought to master all my life. If I am successful today, you will be witnesses to the most death-defying stunt undertaken in the sport of natation. And if I don't survive, you will have shared the final moments of Captain Matthew Webb, the first man to swim the English Channel. Before I tell you the feat I will be attempting, you may be interested to know a little of my history. It may not surprise you to know that my earliest recollection is of water. The water of these early memories was the River Severn in Shropshire, which ran near our house. It's the longest river in Britain, and it was in its waters that I learned to swim. I believe the younger the boy is in becoming familiar with the water, the easier it will be for him to learn to swim. He should ideally go into the water with others of his own age or older, so that he is ambitious to emulate them. He will first learn to swim in shallow water before venturing beyond his depth. Do not force him into deep water until he feels like doing so himself. His triumph in this respect should be all his own. I hope the day will come, before long, when no boy can say, "I cannot swim," without the same blush of shame with which an ordinary English schoolboy would say, "I cannot play cricket." When this feeling is universal among young lads, we shall soon be a nation of swimmers. As an imaginative child, I often dreamed or pictured myself performing some great feat or act of heroism. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given my future career, it was swimming that gave me my first chance to be a hero. When I was still a boy, I had to rescue my younger brother, Charles. He'd taken it upon himself to cross the river, but found he was too weak to make it to the other side. He'd even sunk below the surface before I managed to reach him, and with my brother Thomas, drag him to safety. It was an early reminder of the danger of water, but also of my own strength in the face of it. I mentioned 2 brothers, but in fact, I was one of 12 siblings. One very strong feeling with me was my determination not to be a burden to my parents. So at the age of 12, I decided to make my own living. Inspired by tales I had read of life on the ocean waves, I had already conceived a desire to go to sea. It was therefore at my own request that I joined the training ship Conway of Liverpool. This was the greatest event of my early life, and I shall never forget the first night I passed on board that ship. The sudden change from a comfortable home and a soft bed to a hard hammock with rough sheets that I was terrified of falling out of. And the change of society. Although many of the boys were respectable, some were highly the opposite. I'm not ashamed to say that on my first night, my hammock was moistened with burning tears. My new life, however, soon became second nature, and in a few weeks, I slept as comfortably and securely in my hammock as I ever did in my little bed at home. At the age of 14, I took my first voyage to sea in a ship called the Cavour and sailed in her for Calcutta. We had extremely bad weather, so bad that we were 14 days in accomplishing the first 100 miles. For the first time in my life, I experienced what a storm at sea was, the full force of it bullying the ship on the water, at once terrifying and awe-inspiring. However, despite the power of the storm, I was not seasick, and indeed never have been since. Thankfully, I am possessed of an extremely strong constitution, and was spared the misery I've often witnessed young lads undergo when at sea for the first time. On my return to England, I visited my native place, and the universal opinion was that the 17 months of exposure to sea air and salt water, not to mention the hard physical work, had made quite a man of me. And I felt the change in myself too. The boundless energy I'd had as a young lad was still there, but it was coupled with a new strength and a confidence in what I was capable of. It wasn't long before that confidence was put to the test. The Suez Canal, recently opened, and a marvel of engineering, cutting thousands of miles from the journey between London and India. I was on board one of the first ships to make the passage through the canal, When the vessel shuddered and ground to a halt, the captain ordered the engine to be cut, and I volunteered to get into the water to see what the problem was. Once in, I took a deep breath and dove under the bulkhead of the ship. Through the murky water, I could see that the rope used for mooring the ship had become entangled in the propeller. It would need to be cut loose before we could continue our course. And until we moved on, no other ship could pass down the canal. The rope was as thick as a man's arm. I would need to slash away at it repeatedly with my knife for as long as I could hold my breath. Each time I submerged myself, I barely felt as though I'd made a scratch before my lungs, screaming for oxygen, compelled me to surface again. I must have come close to drowning several times, but I knew the whole crew were relying on me to get us moving again, so I stuck to my task. And after 2 hours, I cut through the final threads of the rope and emerged to the cheers of my fellows. That day, ladies and gentlemen, I had saved our voyage, but the event which first brought my name before the public in connection with swimming was an attempt to save a life. I was serving as second mate on board a vessel called the Russia, which sailed between New York and Liverpool. On the return voyage, a young fellow named Michael Hines was in the main rigging when he missed his hold and fell backwards into the water. I saw him fall, heard the cry of, "Man overboard!" and without a thought for my own safety, I jumped in after him. The sea was very rough, with waves as high as houses and bitterly cold. I looked around, but all I could see was my poor shipmate's cap. He must have been dragged under the ship and struck by the propeller, so that my hopes of recovering him were now lost. Then it dawned on me that I was left alone in a desperate struggle with the wild Atlantic. Imagine how you would feel, one man in the middle of an ocean, not knowing if any attempt would be made for your rescue. I thought how hard it would be to die in the prime of health and strength, but did not quite despair and kept a sharp lookout. After what seemed like an age, as I rose to the top of a gigantic wave, I thought I saw a speck in the distance. Was it a boat? It might be my fancy only. Again, the speck appeared, but nearer. It was a boat, but rowing away from me towards the ship. They had given up searching for me. In an agony of despair, I shouted with almost superhuman strength, "Over here!" They heard me, and so, after 37 minutes in the water, I was rescued. For this attempt to save life, the passengers on board the Russia showed their liberality by collecting for me the sum of £100. But more than this, my greatest accolade for my leap into the Atlantic was the Stanhope Gold Medal from the Royal Humane Society. This was awarded for the best act in connection with saving human life. although I might have protested that I had failed to save a life. Still, I was proud to be presented with the award by the Duke of Edinburgh, and I look upon my receipt of their first ever gold medal as one of the most fortunate coincidences in what has been a somewhat fortunate career. I've often been asked when I first became interested in channel swimming, and I have to admit I did not conjure up the idea myself. My inspiration, if you can call it that, was reading of the attempt of J.B. Johnson. The attempt in question might well be called a strange affair. The man was known as the champion swimmer of England, but he had already shown he was not above cheating. A year before his channel attempt, he had attracted publicity by diving off London Bridge to rescue an elderly man from drowning. However, the guilt was considerably removed from the gingerbread when it was discovered that the drowning man was none other than Johnson's brother, himself a fine swimmer. On the day of his channel attempt, he wore 40 medals and was played to Dover Pier by a brass band. He played to the crowd for 3 hours before diving in and striking out with his overhand stroke. There is no doubt this stroke is by far the most effective. But it is also more exhausting than the breaststroke. And so it proved for Johnson. He lasted little over an hour in the water before clambering aboard a steamer which took him to France. Far from being humbled by his failure, as the steamer approached Calais, he jumped back in the water and swam ashore. A crowd had gathered, having heard of the attempt, and when he emerged on the beach, there were cries of, "Mon Dieu, has this man swum from Dover?" "Yes," said the captain of the steamer, "and he is tired and wants a bit of lunch." Apparently what Johnson lacked in staying power, he made up for in gumption. I was determined that if I were going to swim the channel, it would be an honest attempt, unlike Johnson. I was looking for challenges that might prepare me for such a feat, when one day I heard a gentleman boasting of the extraordinary power of his dog in the water. Strange to say, this gentleman's Newfoundland dog became my first swimming opponent. I backed myself to remain in the water longer than the dog, and the gentleman accepted my wager. The day I chose was rather rough and not at all adapted to the dog style of swimming. I had no difficulty remaining in the water an hour and a half, by which time the poor brute had almost perished. Before I was forced to rescue it, though, the dog showed its good sense by swimming over to its master's boat and making efforts to climb up the side. I am inclined to think their wonderful power of endurance has been greatly overrated. I also think the Royal Humane Society would have been justified in demanding their medal back had I let the dog drown. I knew that swimming against dogs was not the ideal preparation for an earnest attempt on the channel. I also knew that having an experienced trainer might be a great help. So I approached Robert Watson, who published the magazine Swimming Notes and Record under the pen name Aquarius. He also acted as starter and referee at many swimming races. Here, I thought, was the man best placed to help me. So I simply arrived at his office one day and told him, "I want to swim the channel." Although he was inclined to doubt much of what I told him about my past swimming exploits, Watson did me one great favour. Possibly in order to get me out of his hands and into someone else's, he introduced me to the man who would become my mentor, Professor Frederick Beckwith. Beckwith was one of a kind. Not content with just owning a cigar shop, he also ran the swimming club at Lambeth Baths. From this base, he extended his influence over much of the English swimming world. He was the man who trained the best swimmers, and the races he organised were the ones that everyone wanted to compete in or spectate at. He was also a great showman, taking his aquatic family on tours of the country, giving exhibitions of the art of natation. Beckwith himself would demonstrate his command of the water by swimming with his hands and feet tied together. I do not believe Beckwith was impressed with me or my project at our first meeting. A man he'd never heard of, announcing he would undertake a task no man had accomplished. I would need to prove myself to him before he would take me on. So he gave me a chance to do just that by taking me in a boat to Westminster Bridge to see how far I could swim in the cold water. A crowd of spectators on the bridge watched as I set off, eager to prove to Beckwith that I was not a fantasist. After 10 minutes, I'd reached Waterloo Bridge. Another 10 and I was at Blackfriars. Southwark Bridge was the next landmark I passed, followed by London Bridge and the Tower of London. As Beckwith and Watson watched my progress from the boat, I swam until my companions were tired of looking at me. And when I proposed to turn round and swim back the other way, Beckwith told me, "If you do, you'll not have me for a companion." At which point I returned to the boat, the newest member of his swimming team. So, I had a trainer. I was in my physical prime, and I was readying myself to leave the merchant service and devote myself to my training. But it was at this point that a rival entered the fray. For a time, he would capture the public imagination, but I would be loath to have my name associated with his. The American, Paul Boynton, who styled himself captain but was nothing of the sort, presided over the life-saving service in Atlantic City. In his own words, his interest in life-saving amounted to a craze, so he was just the man to publicise the so-called benefits of Merriman's patent waterproof life-saving device. This was the creation of C.S. Merriman, an inventor from Iowa. His motivation to save lives may have been genuine, but I believe the best way to prevent deaths from drowning is a sound instruction in how to swim. Merriman, however, thought differently and had dreamed up a waterproof rubber suit with inflatable air chambers, which could keep afloat anyone weighing up to 300 pounds. The suit also came with a rubber bag, which could carry enough food and water for 10 days, a small lamp, and a paddle. It was claimed that anyone who found themselves on a sinking ship could put on this suit in under a minute and paddle themselves to land. There was even a small sail to attach to a hook on the feet in case the wearer grew tired from too much paddling. Merriman wanted to bring his invention to the notice of the public, and he decided the best way to do this was to have Boynton paddle across the channel in it, just months before I was to make my own attempt. On the chosen day, he arrived late, claiming this was because it took him longer to put on the suit on account of his wearing thicker stockings than usual. When he did show up, he was brandishing a packet of letters, which he dubbed the Boynton Mail for the Continent. He even found time to showboat to the crowd by smoking a cigar as he floated in the harbour. But his insouciance didn't last long, for after 3 hours, the weather turned against him. The New York Herald reporter, watching from a steamer, found it strangely fascinating to watch his hand-to-hand struggle with the sea. The waves seemed to become living things, animated by a terrible hatred of the strange being battling them. Before long, he was also battling the current, and as no one in the accompanying steamer knew quite where they were, he was persuaded to abandon his attempt after 15 hours in the water. Despite his failure, when he arrived in France, he was treated as a hero. In Boulogne, 20,000 spectators came to watch his demonstration of Merriman's preposterous suit in the harbour, and he was awarded a gold medal from the Boulogne Humane Society, which I can only think is not equal in value to mine from the Royal Humane Society. Perhaps encouraged by the adulation he received, the fearless frogman, as he became known, was ready to try again the following month. This time he started in France and crossed to Dover, which I must say is the rather easier way of doing things. He had more favourable conditions than his first attempt, and was 4 miles from the shore when he heard a tremendous blowing behind him. Thinking it was a shark, he drew out his knife, ready to strike if he had been attacked. But then The creature jumped clean over him, and he realized it was a porpoise. After this near miss, it was plain sailing for Boyton. I was appalled when after nearly 24 hours he completed his crossing. For his feat, he received telegrams of congratulations from Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales. It is true that he completed his crossing before me and would go on further expeditions down the Rhine, the Danube, and other European rivers. But I was about to show that flesh and blood and an iron will were more than a match for his rubber suit and paddle. In earnest in my attempt, I began building up the length of my swims, and as conditions in the channel were quite a different proposition from what I was used to in Lambeth Baths, I moved down to the coast to train in the sea. I did not swim for more than an hour a day as a usual thing, but every 10 days I took a very long swim of 4 or 5 hours. On one occasion, I swam out as far as the Barn Buoy, which is about 10 miles off Folkestone, and just 2 weeks later, in heavy rain, I swam the 20 miles from Dover to Ramsgate, remaining in the water for nearly 9 hours. I now felt ready to face my big job, egged on by the continued newspaper reports of Boyton's exploits. But first, I had to wait for the weather to be favourable, which in the first week of August it certainly was not. The delay was not favourable to my state of mind, for it gave me time to dwell on the enormity of the task ahead. I will admit to some small fear of being laughed at by strangers if I failed. More than this, I dreaded the kindness and sympathy of my friends. Finally, on August the 12th, the weather augured well. No wind, no waves, and the sea presenting a rarely calm appearance, as though oil had been poured on its surface. As I dove off Admiralty Pier and started swimming away, with the white cliffs of Dover behind me, I could hear people cheering on the shore. But the billows soon overflowed that pleasant sound and seemed to strike at me angrily. The tide turned against me after a little, but although the waves were pretty rough, I was still getting the better of them. I was not cold, but rather cheerful, for I heard that I'd gone 7 miles towards the coast in a little over 4 hours. But the sea was rising every minute, breaking over the small boat that was accompanying me and threatening to swamp it. At times, I could catch occasional glimpses of heaving heads over the side of the boat, all vestige of colour gone. The sea was making a shuttlecock upon me, but I worked away and accomplished 9 miles. Finally, though, those in the small boat had suffered so much that they called out to me that they could stand it no longer. It was no use. There was too much sea on. I was bitterly disappointed, for I was strong and hearty and had covered more than half the distance across, but there was no help for it. And so, after 7 hours, I returned to the boat a beaten man. My dismay at this defeat was as vast as the channel itself, but I'd come too far to give up. I had left the merchant service, to which I'd given half my life, for a chance to make history. As soon as I'd recovered, and the sea was sufficiently calm, I had to make another attempt. Nearly a fortnight passed while I wondered whether conditions would be in my favour again that year. To have to wait until the following summer, with Boyton holding the upper hand, would have been unendurable. All I could think about was getting back in the channel and swimming towards immortality. Eventually, on the 24th of August, the sea appeared calm enough to venture out on the water. I had a hearty breakfast of bacon, eggs and claret and made my way to the harbour. I had, of course, an immense amount of advice. One precaution I did take was to cover my body in grease to provide insulation against the cold water. I chose porpoise oil and applied it so liberally that I very much resembled some large seal or huge fish, not only in smell but in appearance. I knew that in order to reach the French coast, I would have to raise the bar of human endeavour. Well, no one had gone before me to map the way. The captain of the boat accompanying me, George Toms, knew all about the tides, but very little of swimming. Could I be sure he knew the best path for me to reach Calais? It occurred to me that there were many bodies lying at the bottom of this forbidding stretch of water. The white ship had perished in Norman times, taking with it the son and heir of King Henry I. Countless Spanish sailors, defeated in their armada by Drake and the English fleet, were somewhere on the seabed. Perhaps I was to join them. It was a sobering thought, but I was determined not to give up while I had strength to wag a finger. So I told myself that nothing great is easy, and plunged in. I was perhaps too eager and made a fast start, 25 strokes a minute. A fast breaststroke swimmer might keep up that sort of pace for a mile, but swimming the channel at such a speed would have been impossible. So I soon slowed down to a steadier pace of 20 strokes a minute, which I was to keep up for much of my swim. After a couple of hours, I thought I'd better take on some nourishment. So I treaded water while I drank half a pint of beer that was passed to me from the boat. I set off again feeling confident and happy with my progress so far. It wasn't long before some porpoises swam into view, prompting many jokes from the boat. The captain suggested that one of them should be captured and boiled down in case I should need more grease. I was even asked whether I hadn't bribed some of these creatures to shove me along in the water. But I had no need of aid and held my course with my eyes on the horizon, hoping before long to see the French coast. I was going along capitally when the sun set, just after 7 in the evening. I'd had some beef tea and was feeling right to the trivet and quite warm. Now, in the darkness, all I had to see by was the light from the boat. I was told afterwards that it seemed to surround me in a halo of glory, as in pictures of early Christian martyrs. Swimming at night was a curious sensation. I could see little further than my arms in front of me as they continued their pushing. The light of the moon shining on the water gave it a magical quality. The gentle up and down of the waves and the steady rhythm of my breathing felt almost as though I were in a heavy slumber, swimming in my sleep. Time seemed suspended. How long had it been dark? How long till dawn would break and I could fix my eyes on the French coast? Had I made any progress at all in these hours of darkness? Had I even been swimming in the right direction? As my mind turned over these questions, I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder. I'd been stung by a jellyfish, one of those ghostly inhabitants of the sea. Even in daylight, one is ignorant of their approach until there is nothing to be done. How many more of them were lying in wait for me? I had no way of knowing. I was reminded of an earlier sting I'd received while training. Then I'd been so violently sick that I'd been forced to abandon my swim. But this time the pain was not too great, and I suffered no further attacks. My friends in the boat passed me some brandy, which I poured on the wound. I don't know whether it was that or the salt water, but soon enough I was feeling all right. I carried on, but from this point my stroke was certainly slowing down. The hours passed and I kept swimming, aware of the mass of water that surrounded me. The sea enveloped me, embraced my body, perhaps as eager to consume me as I was to conquer it. With hours in my wake, but hours still to go, all my instincts screamed out for the ordeal to be over, for respite, for dry land and a warm bed. That instinct was what I was fighting, as much as the tide or jellyfish or my own waning powers. but I was driven on by whatever is in the human spirit that makes us strive to push further, to new heights, new continents, new worlds. While England slept, one of its sons was writing a new chapter in its history. That chapter was in its 13th hour when the white chalk cliffs of Cap Grisnez came into view by the light of the moon. This was my destination, the closest part of France to England, sticking out like a nose into the channel. Sunrise was still a few hours away, but in those early hours of daylight, I might be ashore. This thought momentarily lifted my spirits, and I allowed myself to imagine being at Calais, swim completed, by trial overcome. But I was still a few miles from the shore when the tide turned against me. I was down to 16 badly executed strokes a minute and was being carried away from Cap Grisnez. I longed to touch something other than water, but I was slipping further from my goal. Although I didn't know it at the time, opinion in the boat was that I had no chance. And my young friend Baker stripped and was ready to dive in after me with a life belt round his waist in case I should need rescuing. But I called out, "All right!" asked for some brandy and coffee, and swam on as the wind sprang up. Hours later, I was still persisting, but my hands had dropped in the water and my fingers were splayed. As I grew weaker, the wind and tide became stronger. In short, the sea was killing me by inches. At 9:30 in the morning, after more than 20 hours in the water, the Royal Mail Packet Service came into view. They sent out a boat which rode alongside me, and very useful it was indeed, for it acted as a sort of breakwater. It offered me some small respite from the waves when I most needed it. My legs were now so weak that I struggled to bring them together at the end of each stroke, and I could barely hold myself up in the water. I was only managing 12 strokes a minute, but then I could see beach huts on the shore. Baker was now swimming alongside me for encouragement, and the men in the mailboat struck up Rule Britannia. A large crowd was waiting on the beach as the rowers pushed their oars into the water and struck the bottom. I let my legs drop. And for the first time in nearly 22 hours, I felt solid ground. I can only say that the moment I touched the Calais sands, I felt French soil beneath my feet. It is one which I will never forget, were I to live for 100 years. I fell forward and had to be helped to my feet by two men, one on either side of me. The large crowd was cheering in amazement and jubilation, and many of the onlookers had tears in their eyes, especially those who had accompanied me from Dover. Exhausted as I was, my friends wrapped me in a thick blanket, gave me some hot wine, and carried me away in a carriage to my hotel. The next day, after a good night's rest, I did not feel very much the worse for what I'd undergone. I had a peculiar sensation in my limbs, similar to what is often felt after the first day of the cricket season. And I could not wear a shirt collar for a week, owing to a red raw rim around my neck. On my arrival, the general opinion of the people of Calais was that our boat was a floating lunatic asylum, and that I was the biggest lunatic. But as the facts of my swim became known, they came to regard me as an extraordinary creature, half man, half fish. My hotel was crowded with well-wishers, or those who simply wanted to get a look at me. But I had no more earnest desire than to return home. So I accepted an invitation from the Dover Steamship Company for free passage. I certainly wasn't ready to swim home. The moment we sailed into the harbour, it was clear my life had changed. I felt like the same man, but the world regarded me differently. There were people as far as the eye could see. My fellow countrymen cheered me ashore, waving their hats and handkerchiefs. It seemed that everyone wanted to shake my hand or touch me, as though I were gifted with the powers of healing. I finally made it back to my hotel, where I could read some of the telegrams and glowing newspaper reports of my swim. It was lauded as the best feat of swimming yet put on record, and I was described as probably the best known and most popular man in the world. Days later, I returned to my home village, hoping to escape all the attention. But somehow people had found out I was on my way, and I arrived to a hero's welcome. As my train pulled into the nearest station, I saw flags and bunting hanging out of shop windows. The refreshment room was packed with women, clasping banners, flowers and ribbons. And outside the station, hundreds were gathered, straining to catch a glimpse of the famous Captain Webb. It took me half an hour to get from the station to the carriage waiting outside. But then the crowd unharnessed the horses and started pulling the carriage themselves. As we made our way home, the 7th Shropshire Rifles played "See the Conquering Hero Comes," and the evening was aglow with torches along the banks of the Severn. As we neared our destination, the sound of church bells, cheers and applause filled the normally quiet village. These were my people. I had grown up amongst them in this unassuming part of the world. But now I was a giant in their midst, a phenomenon they were in awe of. This was the part of my Channel swim I was least prepared for. I planned for pushing my body to its limits and had trained to withstand the cold and exhaustion. But unlike Boyton, I was not seeking attention. So when it came, I was caught on the back foot, unsure what to do next. The time had come for me to look to my living. But what path was I to take? As the Times once wrote of me, can there be any position more awful than that of a man who has been a 9 days wonder on the morning of the 10th day? My testimonial fund had reached nearly £2,500, but although this was wisely invested, it brought me no more than a lowly clerk. I tried my hand as a public lecturer, but the turnout for my first appearance was discouraging enough to make me think again. I considered becoming a swimming teacher or going into business, but after the exhilaration of my Channel swim, I could muster little enthusiasm for either prospect. So it was with some reluctance that I returned to the arena of competitive swimming. My old friend Professor Beckwith had come up with the idea of a swimming marathon. Endurance events were taking increasing hold on the public imagination. Competitors were pitted against each other to the point of exhaustion in walking and cycling, although not everyone was taken with the new craze. The editor of Land and Water wrote, "There is no way of knowing what may still be in store for us. Perhaps a 40-day fasting match at the Agricultural Hall. And no doubt a row of ghastly skeletons on the verge of dissolution would draw the British public." But such carping in the sporting press did not deter Beckwith from announcing the long-distance swimming championship of the world. The world being represented by 5 swimmers from Great Britain. It was to be held over 6 days, with a maximum of 14 hours in the pool each day. Whoever had swum the furthest at the end of the 6th day will be declared the winner and receive a prize of £70. My fellow competitors were to be Beckwith's son Willie, an amateur champion named Fern, and 2 local champions named Taylor and Rowbottom. On the first day, Beckwith's bold idea and canny promotion certainly drew a crowd. Lambeth Baths, where the event was held, was packed with everyone from generals and colonels to literary geniuses and political magnates. There were even members of the aristocracy present, their carriages queuing down Westminster Bridge Road. When the competition started, it became clear that if I were to win, it must be by taking the role of tortoise to the other swimmers' hares. Young Beckwith was the first to complete a mile, followed by Taylor, Fern, and row bottom. I myself was bringing up the rear, but it wasn't long before my competitor's lack of staying power allowed me to improve my position. Row bottom left the pool to sample the gin palaces down the road. Fern's unhurried breakfast cost him valuable time, and Taylor's weakness was the frequency and length of his breaks, so that by the end of the first day, I was only 4 lengths behind Beckwith, and we were both 2 miles ahead of our nearest rival. On the second day, I was the only swimmer to enter the pool at the correct hour. Beckwith was suffering from the cold and a swollen knee, which slowed him down greatly. Rowbottom and Taylor's prolonged breaks kept them out of contention, and it was only Fern who kept up a good pace, finishing the day second to myself. On the third day, Rowbottom abandoned the contest entirely. On the fourth day, even I was suffering the ill effects of hour upon hour of monotonous swimming. My right eye was swollen so badly it had to be bandaged. My body was aching too much for me to hide how exhausted I was. I can only imagine that many observers, looking on at my pitiful condition, must have found it barely credible that I had ever swum the channel. On the fifth day, our energies were so entirely spent that none of us could bring ourselves to get into the water. Professor Beckwith was forced to send his daughter out to entertain the audience with a display of ornamental swimming. She turned somersaults, swam through hoops, and even ate a sponge cake underwater. I don't think anyone in attendance was disappointed to see this young mermaid, least of all myself and the other swimmers, who enjoyed some respite from the struggle to wring more lengths from our weary limbs. Somehow, 4 of us managed to compete on the 6th and final day, and Beckwith doubled the entrance fee for anyone wanting to see the conclusion to our peculiar, self-inflicted suffering. It came as no surprise to myself that my superior stamina won the day. I took first place with 74 miles swum, equivalent to more than 3 times the length of the channel. This was 11 miles more than Fern had managed, and 30 more than Beckwith. I had won, but I felt more relief that the ordeal was over than satisfaction at my victory. And my prize money did not compensate for the toll the event took on my body. My lasting memory of the event was that it cheapened rather than elevated the cause of swimming. My old friend Professor Beckwith would organise another swimming marathon shortly after, but it took place without Captain Matthew Webb. After the sorry spectacle at Lambeth Pass, it was perhaps a good thing that I sought a change of scenery. I had heard that the public in America had a great interest in swimming. Even Johnson, who had failed to swim the channel, had found success there. Surely, the first and only successful channel swimmer would make a great triumph in the New World. As soon as I arrived on this side of the Atlantic, I determined that my first swim would be from Sandy Hook to Manhattan Beach. Having swum over 20 miles from Dover to Calais, I was sure this 10-mile stretch of the Atlantic would be within my powers. I will admit my confidence dimmed a little when my accompanying boat was late, the inexperienced captain prognosticating disaster. But I wasn't about to pass up the opportunity of earning myself £1,000 and entered the water just after 9 in the evening. I made good progress, spurred on by the delightful sight of a pair of butterflies which floated above my head at one point. At 2 in the morning, I was only a mile from Manhattan Beach, but maddeningly, my contract required me to stay in the water for a further 3 hours. The wind and tide were actively pushing me towards the shore, so that I had to fight to stop myself being carried along and arriving too early. The sea became rougher the longer I stayed in. Waves were washing over the side of the boat, and the amateurish pilot decided he had enough. Leaving 2 passengers in a smaller boat to stay with me, the steamer turned tail and made for the shore. When I finally emerged on the beach, tired after what had been a dispiriting swim, I was greeted with the news that Paul Boyton had just arrived in town. My old nemesis was still trying to promote that absurd life-saving suit. He had slinked off after I'd outshone him in the channel, but now that I was in his country, he had a fresh challenge. If I accepted, our contest could only boost his profile and sell more of Merriman's rubber suits. But if I refused, he could claim a victory over me which could damage my reputation in the new world. What could I do but accept? Our race was to be in the sea off Newport. 2 boys were positioned in the water, half a mile apart. My task was to swim around these boys 20 times. Boyton would attempt to paddle round them 25 times. Whichever of us completed our distance first would be the winner. We each put up £1,000 of our own money, and a local casino owner added 1,000 more. With so much at stake, Boyton was in no mood for niceties. At the starting point, he held out his hand, but before I could shake it, he said, "Well, Captain Webb, there are only 2 of us and one of us has to win. If I lose, I shan't think any more of you. And if I win, I shan't think any less of you than I do. Which is it going to be?" I said he should call on me that evening and I would tell him. We set off just after 2 in the morning, and I was not unduly worried when Boyton reached the first boy ahead of me. He had to paddle 5 more laps than me, so if I could only keep him in my sights, I would be sure to win the victor's spoils. I even allowed myself a little showboating by smoking a cigar at one point while I floated in the water. Back on the beach, the sun had risen and the crowd was growing. Its numbers swelled by new arrivals in carriages. Lunch baskets were opened, champagne corks were popped, and I dare say the onlookers were having a jollier time of it than either of us in the high sea. From time to time, Boyton had to lay down his paddle and stretch his fingers, clearly in some discomfort. I myself was feeling the cold terribly, but I persevered for as long as I was able. Then, suddenly, I was rendered powerless. For the first time in my career, my body had let me down. An appalling cramp had taken hold of both my legs, so that they felt as heavy as concrete. My muscles were twisted in knots. My stomach was in agony, and I was shivering as though I had a fever. I was hoisted into the boat, where the oarsmen set about rubbing my calf muscles. They worked vigorously, doing their best to relieve the worst of my suffering. Eventually, I was returned to my hotel to rest, while Boyton paddled on to victory. I drifted asleep to the sound of cheers as he triumphantly came ashore. I cannot deny that my first attack of cramp was a great disappointment. My body had always got me through whatever challenges I had attempted, feats previously thought impossible, but now it had failed me. Was the time approaching when I could no longer rely on my physical prowess to swim for a living? For the moment, I was able to put such thoughts aside. My match against Boyton had surely been too soon after my swim from Sandy Hook to Manhattan Beach. With more rest, I was sure I could defeat him in a similar contest. So this time, it was I who issued the challenge. Never one to shy away from the limelight, Boyton accepted. 2.5 weeks later, feeling rested, I faced him on the beach again. 3 boys were in the water. I had to swim around 2 of them. My opponent had to paddle round all 3. Conditions were not ideal. The sea was so rough that the boat carrying my provisions was overturned before we began. But a large crowd had gathered, so there was no backing out. It was a long race. Curiously, over such a distance, my strength and speed did not decline gradually, but ebbed and flowed like the tide itself. At times I suffered great pains in my head, but then pushed through them to rally for a time. My eyes stung from the salt water, but after some brandy given me from the press boat, I found the spirit to stick to the task at hand. Boyton had been ahead from the start, but coming into the final stretch, I had a resurgence of strength. My previous mile had taken 84 minutes, but now I nearly halved that time. 45 minutes it took me to swim the final mile in the dark and snatch victory from Boyton's hands. Or so I thought. The speed of my final mile had been so unexpected, so out of the blue that some simply could not believe it. The next day, the referee accused me of having swum ashore, run along the beach, and swum back to the stake boat to finish. He also claimed to have 4 witnesses to my cheating. It was the most infamous charge ever made against a professional man. I never left the water. 4 policemen were patrolling the beach with lanterns and would testify in my favour. And how could I run after having swum for more than 8 hours? No man could do it. The referee had been looking for evidence against me all day, and I soon found out why. This man, who should have been impartial, was the father of Boyton's fiancée. How could he not have tried everything possible to favour his future son-in-law? His relationship to my opponent, and the fact that his witnesses never materialised, should have destroyed the credibility of his claims. But the Boston papers, perhaps seeing Boyton as one of their own, chose to side with him. To them, I was an interloper, and the dishonest one at that. I left America with the word cheat ringing in my ears. Back in Britain, the following year, 1880, I took part in my strangest exhibition yet. It did not take place in the sea, in a river, or even in a swimming pool, but in the Royal Westminster Aquarium. This fine building contained 13 large tanks of water, home to a panoply of exotic creatures. The public could come and stare at a succession of impressive marine animals, all in their natural element, if not their natural environment. One of the tanks was empty, its last living inhabitant a whale, which had perished in its too warm water. When I heard of this, I offered to take its place. Captain Webb would become a living, breathing and swimming exhibit for 60 hours, during which time I would not leave the water. My hopes were twofold. First, that I would not expire in the tank, unlike the unfortunate whale. And second, that the public would pay good money to see the hero of the English Channel. Before entering the water, I said a few words to those present, who were few enough in number. I was honest in stating my motivation. I was not doing this for the love of the thing, but for money. One gentleman responded to this by offering me a sovereign, but alas, I had no pocket to put it in. As I began moving idly around the tank, I sought to make more conversation with spectators in order to make the time pass more pleasantly. But before long, the organisers put up a notice. Do not speak to the man at the wheel. Suddenly, starved of any interaction, observed like any other creature in a tank, those 60 hours loomed as long as 60 days. What was I doing here? Why had I subjected myself to this trial by boredom? How would this further the cause of swimming? My channel crossing had a purpose, to show what was possible and to inspire the younger generation to learn to swim. Here, in this tank, there is no epic distance covered, no awesome feat to proudly boast of. It had come to this. I was a mere curiosity. I looked forward to the clock striking every hour, for each time it meant my deliverance was a little closer. I would rouse myself, perform a few tricks for the crowd, and then conserve energy by floating on my back until the next chime of the clock. Eventually, night came, and with it the crowds were gone. The tranquil atmosphere of the building during these hours was broken only by the calls of exotic birds. Bald-headed geese from the Ganges competed with cockatoos in helping to keep me awake. As day broke, this very wakefulness became harder to maintain. I started to feel a desperate tiredness and tried to fall asleep on my back in the water. Of course, this was impossible, but my friends were concerned enough to insist the doctor examine me.
after nearly 40 hours. It was a relief to leave the tank for this examination. For 21 blessed minutes, I was out of the element in which I had made my name, but which had now held me captive for over a day and a half. But this respite was over soon enough. The doctor found no reason why I should not continue. And so, back in the water I went.
In this last third of my trial, the time passed more quickly. The atmosphere, which had been rather dull at the start, became livelier. More visitors came, and I would smoke cigars and turn somersaults in the water, more inclined to entertain as the 60 hours drew to a close. In the last hour, a bell rang every 5 minutes, my spirits lifting each time I heard the sweet sound. At the end, I turned one last somersault, ascended the ladder, and staggered back to my dressing room, richer to the tune of £277. My experience in the aquarium had not been a happy one. I found it exhausting, and I fear the public often found it boring. I seemed to be in the middle of a run of unsatisfactory engagements in the water, but on dry land, another engagement ended more happily. At the age of 32, I took the plunge into married life, becoming husband to a lovely wife named Madeline. She was a delicate creature, quite unlike this rough and ready sailor. But she seemed to admire her darling Matt very much and was happy to travel with me to my appearances and exhibitions. She even had her own moment in the spotlight when she was asked to launch a new lifeboat at Tynemouth. Never a dull moment for the wife of a champion swimmer. One of Madeline's virtues was that if she had any worries about any of my exploits, she did not voice them to me. As our family grew, with the birth of a son named after me, I felt I had to search out more opportunities for making money. I had not been an active sailor for 7 years, so what could I do but keep on swimming, even though it took me longer to recover each time. But through it all, never a word of reproach from my wife. Of course, I tried to hide from her the toll my swims were taking on me. But my friends knew better and were less reticent about expressing their concerns. And there were concerns aplenty when I announced that my next swim would be 5 hours in a lake in Lancaster in October. My opponent, G.A. Jennings, was a slow and cumbersome swimmer. He had ambitions to swim the channel, but he might as well have had ambitions to fly to the moon. He would have succumbed to the cold long before he reached Calais. When our race began, it became clear he had no hope of beating me. It took him twice as long as me to finish his first mile. He simply wasn't the swimmer I was, even though I wasn't in my best condition. I was 20 pounds lighter than when I had swum the channel, and this seemed to affect my resistance to the cold. It was like swimming through water impregnated with ice, and I was suffering terribly. My body became so numb that I could barely keep my head above the surface. My nose and throat filled with water and nearly choked me. Towards the end, I started swimming in the wrong direction. My friends rowed over to aid me, but I was hallucinating, talking to someone who wasn't there. Before the race was quite over, I was at the diving board throwing up. I was held back to my dressing room where attempts were made to revive me. In truth, I was still not myself a week later. I sorely needed rest to allow my body to recover and regain strength. How could I slow down? My family had grown, this time with the birth of a daughter. They must be provided for, and I had found no better way of doing this than by swimming. And so swim on I did. Reluctantly back in America, I swam a race through a lightning storm and spent 128 hours in a tank of water, for $1,000. Back in England, I swam against young Beckwith. But since our first head-to-head, when I'd beaten him rather handily, he had become stronger. 10 years my junior, the same age I had been when I had swum the channel. He was in peak condition. Racing over 20 miles in an indoor pool, he pulled ahead. I tried to keep up, drawing on the strength I'd always relied on. But that strength forsook me. I was convulsed with a coughing fit. And when I looked into the water, I saw that it had turned pink from my own blood. It transpired that I had congestion of the lungs. Confined to my bed for 2 weeks, I received a letter from my elder brother, Thomas. As a doctor, he urged me to stop my marathon swims. A man's body starts to decline after the age of 30, he wrote. I must consider my wife and children. Others urged me to consider my reputation. Better to stop now while I was still remembered as the hero of the English Channel and not an aquatic freak. But what I was planning would be even bigger than my channel swim. A feat so audacious, it will link my name forever with this place, with Niagara Falls. In a few moments, I shall swim down these rapids towards the whirlpool. It's a rum bit of water, the angriest bit of water in the world. People have tried to warn me off. The whirlpool is over 100 feet deep, they say. They tell me that 20-foot logs are sucked into it with such force that they stand up like ship's masts. Apparently 80 people have died in these rapids since 1860, but none of them were Captain Matthew Webb. I believe I'm strong enough and skilled enough to go through alive. When I reach the whirlpool, I'll strike out with all my strength and try to stay away from the suck hole in the middle. My life will then depend upon my muscles and my breath, with a little touch of science behind them. I am confident I will be dining this evening in my hotel. So, ladies and gentlemen, put your minds at rest. Fear not, the whirlpool shall not defeat me. Prepare yourselves to witness something extraordinary. The water awaits. I must answer its call.